The Montana sky stretched endless and gray above 12-year-old Emma Walsh as she stood at the crossroads where Timber Creek Road met the old cattle trail. Her small hands clutched a battered canvas bag that held everything she owned in the world: 3 dresses that were too small, a photograph of her parents on their wedding day, and the last $2 Papa had hidden in his Bible before the fever took him that morning. The wind carried this scent of approaching rain and something else: wood smoke from a distant chimney that meant warmth, safety, the kind of home she no longer had. Emma's bare feet were already numb from walking the rocky road since dawn, but she couldn't stop now. Night was coming, and with it, the kind of cold that could steal the life from a child who had nowhere to go. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had begun like any other in the tiny cabin that Papa had built with his own hands. In the shadow of Bear Mountain, Emma had woken to the sound of her father's labored breathing, the rattling cough that had been getting worse for weeks echoing through the thin walls of their one-room home. She'd known immediately that today would be different. There was something final in the way the morning light fell across Papa's pale face, something that made her stomach twist with a fear she'd been carrying for months. "Emma girl," Papa had whispered when he saw her sitting up on her straw mattress in the corner. "Come here to me." She'd crossed the small space between them in 3 quick steps, her nightgown catching on the rough-hewn floorboards Papa had never had time to smooth. His hand, once strong enough to lift her above his head and spin her around until she squealed with laughter, now felt fragile as bird bones when he reached for her fingers. "Listen to me careful now," he'd said, his voice barely stronger then. The wind through the pine trees outside. "I need you to be brave today, braver than you've ever been." Emma had known then what was coming. She'd seen it in the way the neighbor women looked at Papa when they brought their charity soup and day-old bread. She'd heard it in the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the room. Death had been circling their little cabin like a wolf for weeks, and now it was finally ready to claim what it had come for. Papa had lived long enough to tell her about the money hidden in his Bible, about her Aunt Margaret who lived somewhere in Oregon, though they'd never met, and had no way to contact her. He'd lived long enough to make Emma promise she would never let anyone put her in the county orphanage, that she would find a way to survive on her own terms. "You're stronger than you know, little bird," he'd said, using the pet name that had belonged just to them. "You got your mama's heart and my stubborn streak. That'll carry you through whatever comes." And then, as the sun reached its peak above the mountains, Joseph Walsh had closed his eyes for the last time, leaving his daughter alone in a world that had little patience for orphaned children with nowhere to go. Emma had sat beside his still form for an hour, holding his cooling hand and trying to memorize every detail of his face. The crow's feet that deepened when he laughed at her silly jokes, the scar on his chin from where he'd fallen off a horse as a boy, the way his graying hair stuck up in the back no matter how much he tried to smooth it down. She'd known she couldn't stay. The landlord, Mr. Hutchins, would come for the rent money they didn't have. The county officials would come to take her to the orphanage. The neighbors would come with their pity and their good intentions, ready to divide up Papa's few possessions and decide her fate without asking what she wanted. So she'd packed her canvas bag with the only things that mattered, kissed Papa's forehead one last time, and walked away from the only home she'd ever known. Now, 6 hours later, she stood at the crossroads with darkness approaching and nowhere to go. The nearest town was 15 miles south, but Emma knew what waited for her there. Questions she couldn't answer, officials who would send her away, charity that came with strings attached and expectations she wasn't ready to meet. The other direction led deeper into ranch country, where vast spreads of cattle land stretched between isolated homesteads. It was dangerous territory for a child alone, full of wild animals, unpredictable weather, and men who might not look kindly on trespassers. But it was also her only chance of finding somewhere to hide, somewhere to figure out her next move without interference from well-meaning adults, who would never understand why she'd rather face the wilderness than surrender her freedom to an orphanage. A rumble of thunder rolled across the valley, and Emma looked up to see storm clouds gathering in the west. The temperature was dropping fast, and she could already feel the first tentative drops of rain on her cheeks. She needed shelter, and she needed it soon. In the distance, perhaps 2 miles down the cattle trail, she could see smoke rising from what looked like a substantial ranch house. The sight filled her with a mixture of hope and terror. Ranch folks might take pity on a lost child, but they might also ask too many questions, might decide to involve the authorities before she could explain herself properly. Still, she didn't have much choice. The storm was coming whether she was ready or not, and freezing to death in a Montana downpour wouldn't solve any of her problems. Emma adjusted her grip on the canvas bag and started walking toward the distant smoke, her feet finding their rhythm on the rutted trail despite the growing darkness. With each step, she practiced the words she would say when someone answered the door of that ranch house. She would be polite but not pathetic, honest but not desperate. She would ask only for what she needed and nothing more. The rain began in earnest as she walked, cold drops that soaked through her thin dress and made her shiver uncontrollably. By the time she could make out the details of the ranch buildings ahead, she was thoroughly drenched and fighting to keep her teeth from chattering so hard she couldn't speak. The ranch was larger than she'd expected, with a substantial 2-story house surrounded by well-maintained barns, corrals, and outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and careful management. Warm light glowed from several windows, and she could see the silhouettes of people moving around inside. It looked like the kind of place where a family lived, where children might be welcomed and cared for. Or it might be the kind of place where strangers were viewed with suspicion, and unwanted visitors were quickly sent on their way. Emma paused at the edge of the yard, suddenly uncertain about what she was about to do. Once she knocked on that door, there would be no going back. She would have to trust these strangers with her story, with her future, with the desperate hope that someone might be willing to help a child who had nowhere else to turn. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the ranch buildings in stark detail and showing Emma something she hadn't noticed before. There was a large barn just 50 yards from the main house, its doors slightly ajar and warm light spilling out into the storm. Even from a distance, she could hear the gentle sounds of animals settling in for the night horses shifting in their stalls, cattle lowing softly, the comforting murmur of life and safety that meant shelter from the storm. The barn. She didn't need to impose on the family in the house, didn't need to burden them with her problems or explain her situation to people who might not understand. She just needed a dry place to sleep until the storm passed, somewhere safe to spend the night while she figured out her next move. Emma made her decision and hurried across the muddy yard toward the barn, her bare feet splashing through puddles that reflected the lightning above. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the ground to mud and making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. But the barn doors were growing larger with each step, promising warmth and shelter and a few hours of peace before she had to face whatever came next. She was almost there when a deep voice cut through the sound of the storm. "Hold it right there, young lady. Don't take another step." Emma froze, her heart hammering against her ribs as she turned toward the voice. Through the rain and darkness, she could make out the silhouette of a tall man standing on the porch of the ranch house. He was holding what looked like a lantern in one hand, and his voice carried the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed without question. This was it. The moment she'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. Emma straightened her shoulders, tried to summon whatever courage she had left, and prepared to speak the words that would either save her or seal her fate. "Please, sir," she called. Out through the storm, her voice barely audible above the wind and rain. "My papa died today. Can I sleep in your barn?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The lantern light swayed as the tall figure stepped down from the porch, his boots splashing through the muddy yard with purposeful strides. Emma stood frozen in the driving rain, clutching her canvas bag against her chest like a shield, watching as the man approached through the storm. Lightning flashed again, and for a brief moment she could see him clearly, broad shoulders beneath a heavy coat, a weathered face shadowed by the brim of a worn hat, and eyes that seemed to be taking in every detail of her bedraggled appearance. "Sweet, merciful Lord," the man muttered as he drew closer, his voice carrying a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Child, what in tarnation are you doing out in this weather?" Emma tried to speak, tried to repeat the words she'd rehearsed during her long walk, but all that came out was a choked sob. The adrenaline that had carried her through the day was finally giving way to exhaustion, grief, and the overwhelming relief of finding another human being willing to acknowledge her existence. The rancher, for that's clearly what he was. From his practical clothes to his easy way of moving around the animals, lowered his lantern and crouched down so he could look Emma in the eye. Up close, she could see that his face was kind beneath its weathered exterior, marked by laugh lines and the sort of patient expression that suggested he'd spent considerable time dealing with frightened creatures. "Now then," he said gently, his voice barely audible above the storm, "let's start over. What's your name, little miss?" "Emma," she managed to whisper, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. "Emma Walsh, my papa. He died this morning, and I don't have anywhere to go." The man's expression shifted from concern to something deeper, a recognition of pain that suggested he understood exactly what it meant to lose everything that mattered. He glanced toward the barn, then back at Emma's shivering form, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Well, Emma Walsh," he said, standing up and extending his hand toward her, "I'm Samuel Harrison, and this is the Double H Ranch. You're not sleeping in any barn tonight, not in this storm and not in your condition. Come on up to the house where it's warm and dry." Emma hesitated, her hand hovering inches from his. Everything Papa had taught her about being careful around strangers warred with her desperate need for shelter and the genuine kindness she heard in Samuel Harrison's voice. But the decision was made for her when another crack of thunder shook the ground beneath her feet, followed immediately by a deluge of rain that soaked through what remained of her dry clothing. "I promise you're safe here," Samuel said, his voice steady and reassuring. "My wife Clara's inside making supper, and we've got a warm fire and dry clothes. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow when this storm passes." This time Emma didn't hesitate. She placed her small, cold hand in his large, calloused one and let him lead her through the mud toward the welcoming lights of the ranch house. The warmth that hit her face when Samuel opened the front door was like stepping into heaven after the cold hell of the storm outside. "Clara," Samuel called as he helped Emma over the threshold, careful to support her when her legs threatened to give out from exhaustion. "We've got company." The woman who appeared from what must have been the kitchen was everything Emma had hoped for and nothing she'd expected. Clara Harrison was perhaps 40 years old, with graying brown hair pinned up in a practical bun and an apron tied around her comfortable figure. But it was her eyes that caught Emma's attention, warm brown eyes that seemed to take in the situation instantly and respond with the sort of maternal instinct that needed no explanation. "Oh, you poor dear," Clara murmured, rushing forward to take Emma's other arm. "Samuel, get some towels from the linen closet. This child is soaked to the bone and half frozen besides." Within minutes, Emma found herself wrapped in warm, dry towels and seated in a chair that had been pulled close to the kitchen fire. Clara bustled around her with the efficient care of someone who had dealt with plenty of emergencies over the years. checking for signs of illness or injury while Samuel heated water for tea and gathered dry clothes from somewhere upstairs. "Now." "Then," Clara said softly, kneeling beside Emma's chair and smoothing the wet hair back from her face, "Samuel told me your name is Emma and that you've had a terrible day. Do you want to tell me what happened, sweetheart?" The story came out in fits and starts, interrupted by tears and the chattering of Emma's teeth as warmth gradually returned to her body. She told him about Papa's long illness, about waking up that morning to find him worse than ever, about holding his hand as he died, and the terrible silence that followed. She told them about the money hidden in the Bible, about Aunt Margaret in Oregon who might not even exist, about her determination never to end up in the county orphanage where children disappeared into a system that cared more about order than individual needs. Samuel and Clara listened without interruption, their faces reflecting the kind of quiet sympathy that came from people who had seen their share of hardship and understood that sometimes life dealt blows that were almost too heavy to bear. When Emma finished her story, exhaustion overtaking her ability to speak, Clara gathered her into a warm embrace that smelled of flour and cinnamon and the indefinable scent of safety. "You've been so brave," Clara whispered against Emma's hair. "So very brave, making it all this way on your own. But you don't have to be brave anymore tonight. Tonight you can rest." "But I can't stay," Emma protested, pulling back to look at Clara with eyes that were older than they should have been. "I don't have any money to pay you, and I can't be a burden. If the county officials find out where I am, let us worry." "About the county officials," Samuel said firmly, settling into a chair across from Emma with a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. "For tonight, you're our guest. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next, but not before you've had a good night's sleep and a proper breakfast." The dry clothes Clara brought down turned out to belong to someone else, a girl about Emma's size, judging by the fit of the simple dress and undergarments. Emma noticed Clara's hesitation when she handed over the clothes, the way her fingers lingered on the fabric as if it held memories too precious to share with a stranger. But Clara's voice was steady when she explained. "These were my daughter Sarah's clothes," she said simply. "She would have been about your age now if things had been different. I think she would have liked sharing them with someone who needed them." Emma understood without being told that Sarah Harrison was no longer part of this household, no longer part of this world. The careful way Clara spoke about her, the past tense that carried weight beyond mere grammar, told the story more clearly than any detailed explanation could have. This family had known loss, had faced the kind of devastating grief that Emma was just beginning to understand. That knowledge made their kindness even more remarkable. Here were people who had every reason to protect themselves from further heartbreak, every justification for keeping strangers at arm's length, rather than risk caring about someone who might disappear from their lives as suddenly as she had appeared. Yet they had opened their home without hesitation, offered comfort without conditions, and treated her with the sort of gentle respect that suggested they saw her as a person worthy of care rather than problem to be solved. Dinner was a quiet affair, with Emma struggling to stay awake long enough to eat the hearty stew and fresh bread that Clara placed before her. The food was better than anything she'd tasted in months. Papa's illness had meant a lot of thin soup and day-old bread from sympathetic neighbors, but exhaustion was finally catching up with her. She found herself nodding off between bites, her head growing heavy despite her efforts to maintain proper table manners. "That's enough for tonight," Clara said gently, helping Emma to her feet. "Let's get you upstairs and into a proper bed. Everything else can wait until morning." The room Clara led her to was small but comfortable, with a single bed covered in quilts that looked handmade and a window that would offer a view of the ranch yard when daylight returned. On the knitstand sat a kerosene lamp and a glass of water, simple touches that spoke of thoughtful hospitality rather than grudging charity. "The chamber pot is under the bed if you need it during the night," Clara explained, pulling back the quilts to reveal sheets that smelled of sunshine and fresh air. "And don't worry about anything else tonight, Emma. You're safe here. We'll take care of you." As Emma settled into the soft mattress, softer than anything she'd slept on since Mama died 3 years ago, she heard Clara and Samuel's voices drifting up from the kitchen below. Their words were too quiet to make out, but their tone suggested the kind of serious discussion that would determine her immediate future. She wanted to worry about what they might decide, wanted to plan for the possibility that they might change their minds by morning and send her on her way. But exhaustion was stronger than anxiety, and the warmth of the quilts, combined with the security of solid walls and a locked door, proved more powerful than her fears. For the first time in weeks, Emma felt truly safe, truly protected from the harsh world that had suddenly become her responsibility to navigate alone. Just before sleep claimed her completely, she heard footsteps on the stairs and saw a thin line of light under her door as Clara checked on her one last time. The gesture was so achingly familiar. Mama used to do the same thing when Emma was small and afraid of the dark, that fresh tears threatened to spill down her cheeks. But these weren't tears of grief or despair. For the first time since Papa's death, Emma was crying from relief, from gratitude, from the overwhelming blessing of finding people who were willing to care about a stranger's child with no expectation of reward or recognition. Outside, the storm continued to rage across the Montana landscape, but inside the Double H Ranch, an orphaned girl slept peacefully for the first time in months, dreaming not of loss and uncertainty, but of the possibility that kindness might be stronger than hardship, that family might be something you chose rather than something you were born into, and that sometimes the worst day of your life could lead to the beginning of something beautiful and unexpected. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own decisions and complications. But tonight, Emma Walsh was exactly where she belonged, in the care of people who understood that sometimes the most important choice you can make is to open your door to someone who has nowhere else to go. Emma woke to the unfamiliar sound of roosters crowing and the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance. For a moment, suspended between sleep and wakefulness, she forgot where she was and reached instinctively for Papa's reassuring presence in the bed across their tiny cabin. But instead of rough wooden walls and the smell of wood smoke, she found herself surrounded by clean white sheets and the aroma of bacon frying somewhere below. The events of the previous day crashed back into her consciousness like a physical blow. Papa's death, the desperate flight through the storm, the kindness of strangers who had taken her in without question. Emma sat up slowly, taking in the details of the small bedroom that had seemed like heaven the night before. In daylight, she could see that it had been a child's room, Sarah's room, with delicate touches that spoke of a little girl who had been deeply loved. A wooden doll sat on the dresser, its painted face worn smooth by countless hours of play. Pressed flowers decorated the windowsill in a glass frame, probably picked during some long-ago summer by small hands that had delighted in simple beauties. Most telling of all, a sampler hung on the wall with carefully stitched letters spelling out Sarah Marie Harrison, age 8, 1871, meaning Sarah would indeed have been Emma's age now. If she had lived, the realization that she was sleeping in a dead child's bed should have felt morbid. But instead, it filled Emma with a strange sense of connection. This room had been prepared with love, had sheltered dreams and fears and hopes just like her own. In some inexplicable way, it felt like Sarah herself had left a welcome for the next little girl who would need sanctuary within these walls. Voices from the kitchen below drew Emma's attention to the present. She could hear Clara's gentle tones, mixing with Samuel's deeper rumble, and underneath their conversation ran an undercurrent of serious discussion that made her stomach tighten with anxiety. They were talking about her, she realized, deciding what to do with the orphaned stranger who had appeared on their doorstep in the storm. Emma dressed quickly in Sarah's clothes, which fit well enough despite being perhaps 2 years out of style. The fabric was good quality, better than anything Papa had ever been able to afford for her, and she took care not to wrinkle or damage garments that represented such generous hospitality. When she crept to the top of the stairs, the voices became clearer, though Clara and Samuel were obviously trying to keep their conversation private. Double quotes ... can single quotes T, just send her back out there, Sam, Clara was saying, her voice tight with emotion. That child has been through enough heartbreak for 10 lifetimes. And you saw how she looked last night, half-starved and scared to death. I know, Clara, Samuel replied, his tone heavy with the weight of difficult decisions. But we can't keep her without involving the authorities. There'll be questions about where she came from, whether she has family, what her legal status is. And if word gets out that we're harboring a runaway. Harboring? Clara's voice sharpened. Samuel Harrison, that child isn't a criminal. She's an orphan who's trying to survive, and she came to us for help. If that's not a sign from the Lord about what we're supposed to do, I don't know what is. Emma heard the scrape of a chair against the wooden floor, followed by Samuel's footsteps pacing around the kitchen. She could picture him in her mind, hat in hand, wrestling with the kind of moral complexity that had no easy answers. You know I want to help her, Samuel said finally. But we have to be practical about this. The county's got procedures for dealing with orphaned children, and if we don't follow them, we could end up making things worse for Emma in the long run. Procedures, Clara repeated, and Emma could hear the disgust in her voice. You mean warehousing her in some overcrowded institution where she'd be just another mouth to feed and another body to put to work? Is that really what's best for her, Sam? The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken implications. Emma had heard enough stories about county orphanages to know that Clara's description wasn't exaggerated. Children who went into the system often emerged years later broken in spirit if not in body, trained for nothing but the most menial labor, and stripped of any hope for a better future. There might be another way, Samuel said slowly, his voice thoughtful. My brother Jake knows people in the territorial government. If we were thinking about taking Emma in ourselves, there might be legal ways to make it official without going through the county system. Emma's heart stopped beating for a moment as she processed what Samuel had just said, taking her in themselves, making it official. The possibility was so far beyond what she had dared to hope for that she almost couldn't believe she'd heard correctly. Are you saying what I think you're saying? Clara's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of desperate longing. I'm saying maybe the Lord works in mysterious ways, Samuel replied. Maybe he knew we needed Emma just as much as she needed us. Maybe he knew this house has been too quiet for too long, and that we've got enough love left to share with a little girl who has nowhere else to go. The sound of Clara's chair scraping back was followed by what Emma imagined were footsteps rushing across the kitchen, probably ending in the kind of embrace that spoke of shared dreams and mutual understanding. Oh, Sam, Clara whispered, and Emma could hear tears in her voice. Do you really think we could? Do you think we could be the parents she needs? I think, Samuel said carefully, that Emma Walsh has already shown more courage and determination than most adults ever manage. I think she deserves a chance to be a child again, to have a home and a family and the kind of future she chooses for herself. And I think Sarah would have wanted us to help her. The mention of their lost daughter brought another silence, this one reverent rather than uncertain. Emma found herself holding her breath, afraid to move or make any sound that might interrupt this moment that seemed balanced on the edge of changing everything. We'll need to talk to her first, Clara said eventually. Make sure she understands what we're offering, what it would mean for all of us. This isn't the kind of decision that should be made without her input. Agreed, Samuel said. And we'll need to be honest about the challenges. Taking in an orphaned child, especially one who's been through what Emma has, won't be easy. There'll be grief to work through, trust to build, adjustments for all of us. Emma realized she was crying, tears of gratitude and hope streaming down her cheeks as she listened to these two people discuss the possibility of giving her something she'd never expected to have again: a family. Not the blood family she'd been born into and lost, but a chosen family built on love and mutual commitment rather than mere obligation. The sound of footsteps approaching the stairs made Emma quickly wipe her eyes and hurry back to her room. She had just enough time to sit on the edge of the bed and attempt to look like someone who had just woken up when Clara's gentle knock came at the door. "Emma, sweetheart, are you awake?" "Yes, ma'am," Emma called back, hoping her voice didn't betray the emotional turmoil of the last few minutes. Clara entered the room carrying a basin of warm water and a towel, her face glowing with the kind of contained excitement that suggested momentous decisions had been made. "How did you sleep, dear?" "Better than I have in months," Emma answered honestly. "Thank you for the clothes, and for the bed, and for everything." Clara set the basin on the dresser and turned to study Emma's face with the careful attention of someone trying to gauge another person's readiness for important news. "Emma," she said slowly, "Samuel and I have been talking about your situation, and we'd like to discuss some possibilities with you. But first, let's get you washed up and fed properly. Important conversations deserve full stomachs and clear heads." Breakfast was the most elaborate meal Emma had eaten in years. Fresh eggs from the ranch's chickens, thick slices of bacon, biscuits so light they seemed to melt on her tongue, and butter churned from the cream of their own cows. Samuel and Clara kept the conversation light during the meal, asking gentle questions about her life with Papa and sharing stories about the ranch and their neighbors. But Emma could feel the weight of unspoken possibilities hanging in the air. The sense that all three of them were preparing for a conversation that could change the course of her entire future. When the last of the breakfast dishes had been cleared away, Samuel and Clara exchanged a meaningful look across the kitchen table. Clara reached over to take Emma's hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "Emma," Samuel began, his voice serious but kind, "we want you to know that whatever happens next, you're not going anywhere today. You're safe here, and you're welcome here, for as long as you need somewhere to stay. But beyond that," Clara continued, "we've been thinking about more permanent arrangements. How would you feel about the possibility of staying here, not just as a guest, but as our daughter?" Emma's carefully maintained composure crumbled in an instant. The words she'd been hoping to hear, the offer that seemed too good to be true, hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. "You mean it?" she whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You'd really want me to stay, as part of your family?" "We mean it," Samuel said firmly. "But we want you to understand what that would involve. Legal paperwork to make it official. Rules and expectations and responsibilities that come with being part of a family, and patience while we all learn how to be what each other needs." Emma looked around the kitchen that had already begun to feel like home, at these two people who had shown her more kindness in 18 hours than some people encountered in a lifetime. The choice before her was no choice at all. It was the answer to prayers she'd been afraid to pray. "I'd like that," she said simply. "I'd like that more than anything in the world." And in that moment, as Clara gathered her into another warm embrace, and Samuel's weathered face broke into a grin that transformed his entire appearance, Emma Walsh realized that sometimes the worst day of your life could lead directly to the best decision anyone had ever made on your behalf. The conversation that followed was full of practical details about legal procedures, educational plans, and the daily routines of ranch life. But underneath all the logistics ran a current of mutual commitment, of three people who had found each other at exactly the moment when they most needed what the others could provide. Outside, the Montana sky was beginning to clear after the storm, promising the kind of bright, clean day that made anything seem possible. And inside the kitchen of the Double H Ranch, A new family was taking its first tentative steps toward a future none of them could have. Imagine just 24 hours earlier. 3 weeks had passed since Emma Walsh had stumbled through the storm into the Harrison family's life, and the changes at the Double H Ranch were both subtle and profound. The morning routine now included an extra place at the breakfast table, an additional voice joining the conversation about weather and cattle prices, and the sound of lighter footsteps mixing with Samuel's heavy boots as they made their way to the barn for morning chores. But the most significant change wasn't visible in the daily routines. It was in the way Emma carried herself. The gradual straightening of shoulders that had been bowed by grief and uncertainty, the return of curiosity and laughter to eyes that had held nothing but wariness when she first appeared at their door. This particular morning found Emma perched on the top rail of the corral fence, watching Samuel work with a young mare that had been giving the ranch hands trouble for weeks. The horse was beautiful, a sleek bay with intelligent eyes and a spirit that had never been properly broken, but her previous owner had used harsh methods that left her distrustful of human contact. "Easy, Bella," Samuel murmured, approaching the mare with the same patient gentleness he'd shown Emma on that first stormy night. "Nobody's going to hurt you here. We've got all the time in the world." Emma found herself fascinated by Samuel's approach to the frightened animal. There were no sudden movements, no raised voices or threatening gestures. Instead, he simply stood in the center of the corral, letting Bella investigate him on her own terms, offering treats and gentle words while maintaining the kind of calm presence that invited trust rather than demanding submission. "She's scared," Emma observed, recognizing something familiar in the mare's wary circling and quick retreats whenever Samuel moved too quickly. "She is," Samuel agreed without taking his eyes off the horse. "Someone taught her that humans were dangerous, and now she has to learn all over again that some of us can be trusted. Takes time to undo that kind of damage." The parallel wasn't lost on Emma. In the 3 weeks since the Harrisons had taken her in, she'd been going through her own process of learning to trust, to believe that this kindness wasn't temporary or conditional, that she truly had found a place where she belonged. It hadn't been easy. Years of watching Papa struggle to provide for them, followed by the trauma of his death and her desperate flight, had left Emma with defenses that didn't lower easily. She found herself testing the boundaries of the Harrisons' patience in small ways, leaving tasks half-finished to see if they would scold her, asking questions she already knew the answers to just to hear reassurance, watching their faces carefully for signs that their kindness was wearing thin. But Samuel and Clara seemed to understand her need for constant reassurance without making her feel foolish for requiring it. When she spilled milk at breakfast and braced herself for criticism, Clara simply handed her a cloth and reminded her that accidents happen to everyone. When she woke up crying from nightmares about Papa, Samuel would appear at her bedroom door with warm milk and patient ears, sitting with her until the fears subsided and sleep became possible again. "Emma," Samuel called from the corral, breaking into her thoughts, "would you like to try working with Bella? Sometimes horses respond better to a gentler touch." The suggestion both thrilled and terrified her. Emma had been around horses her entire life. Papa had owned an old gelding that pulled their wagon and provided transportation to town, but she'd never worked with an animal that was actively frightened and unpredictable. "What if I do something wrong?" she asked, climbing down from the fence with careful movements that wouldn't startle the mare. "Then we'll figure it out together," Samuel replied, the same answer he'd given to dozens of her worried questions over the past weeks. "Making mistakes is how we learn, and Bella's not going anywhere. We've got plenty of time to get this right." Emma entered the corral slowly, mimicking Samuel's calm demeanor and quiet movements. Bella watched her approach with ears pricked forward, clearly curious about this new human, who moved without the assertive confidence that had characterized her previous handlers. "Let her come to you," Samuel coached quietly. "Don't try to catch her or corner her. Just be present and patient, and let her decide when she's ready to trust. For 20 minutes, Emma stood motionless in the center of the corral while Bella circled at various distances, occasionally approaching close enough to stretch her neck toward Emma's outstretched hand before retreating to a safer distance. It was frustrating work, requiring a level of patience that Emma had never had to develop before. But there was something deeply satisfying about the gradual progress. The way Bella's circles grew smaller and her retreats less frantic. Finally, the Mari approached close enough to snuffle Emma's palm, investigating the scent of this strange new person who seemed to understand that trust couldn't be forced or demanded. Emma remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as Bella's soft nose explored her fingers, her sleeve, the fabric of her dress. "She likes you," Samuel observed with quiet satisfaction. "Look at her ears forward and relaxed. She's not scared anymore, just curious." The breakthrough came when Bella allowed Emma to stroke her neck, then her shoulder, then gradually work her way around the horse's body with gentle, confident touches that spoke of respect rather than domination. By the end of the session, the Mare was following Emma around the corral like an oversized puppy, clearly enchanted with her new human friend. "That was remarkable," Clara said from her position at the fence, where she'd been watching the entire interaction with obvious pride. "I've never seen Bella respond to anyone that quickly." Emma's face glowed with accomplishment, but there was something deeper in her expression, a recognition that the same patience and gentleness that had worked with Bella was exactly what the Harrisons had been offering her since the night she arrived. They had let her come to them on her own terms, had proven their trustworthiness through consistency rather than demands, and had waited for her defenses to lower naturally rather than trying to break them down by force. That afternoon brought a visitor that would test Emma's newfound sense of security in ways she hadn't anticipated. Judge William Morrison arrived at the ranch in an official capacity, carrying the legal documents that would formalize Emma's adoption and make her a Harrison in the eyes of the law. Judge Morrison was a kind man with a reputation for fairness and a genuine concern for the children who came before his court, but his presence still filled Emma with anxiety. Official visitors meant official questions, and official questions had a way of uncovering complications that could change everything. "Miss Walsh," the judge said gently as they sat around the Harrisons' kitchen table with papers spread between them, "I need to ask you some questions about your circumstances, and I need you to answer honestly. Do you understand?" Emma nodded, her hands clenched tightly in her lap as she prepared to defend her right to stay with the people who had become her family. "First, I need to confirm that you came to the Harrisons of your own free will, that no one forced you to leave your previous home or brought you here against your wishes." "Yes, sir," Emma replied clearly. "Papa died, and I didn't have anywhere else to go. I came here because I was scared and cold, and Mr. and Mrs. Harrison helped me. And now they want to adopt you, to make you their legal daughter. Is this something you want, Emma? Do you understand what it means?" Emma looked across the table at Samuel and Clara, these two people who had taken a frightened, grief-stricken child and offered her not just shelter but genuine love and belonging. Her answer came without hesitation. "It means I get to be there daughter," she said simply. "It means I have a family again and a home and people who care about what happens to me." "Yes, sir, I want that very much." Judge Morrison smiled, his expression softening as he took in the obvious affection between Emma and her chosen parents. "And Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, you understand the responsibilities you're taking on? The legal obligations, the financial commitments, the emotional investment required to raise a child who has experienced significant trauma." "We understand, Your Honor," Samuel replied, his voice firm with conviction. "Emma isn't a burden we're taking on. She's a gift we never expected to receive. We'll love her and provide for her just as if she'd been born to us." "She was born to us," Clara added quietly, "just not in the usual way." Sometimes families are made by choice rather than blood, and that doesn't make them any less real. The legal proceedings took most of the afternoon, with papers to sign and declarations to make and official stamps to apply to documents that would change Emma's life forever. But the most meaningful moment came not during the formal ceremony, but afterward, when Judge Morrison was packing up his papers and preparing to leave. "Emma," he said, turning to address her directly, "I want you to know that what happened here today is unusual. Most orphan children don't find families like the Harrisons, families who choose love over convenience and commitment over obligation. You're very fortunate, but more than that, you deserve this happiness. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." After the judge left, Emma found herself overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. In the space of a few hours, she had gone from being an orphan child dependent on the charity of strangers to being a legally recognized member of a family that wanted her not out of duty, but out of genuine love. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table that was now officially hers, Samuel raised his glass of cider in a toast. "To Emma Harrison," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Our daughter, our family, our blessing. Welcome home, sweetheart. Welcome home for good." Emma tried to respond, tried to find words that could express the gratitude and joy and overwhelming sense of belonging that filled her heart, but all that came out was a whisper. "Thank you for choosing me." "Thank you for letting us," Clara replied, gathering Emma into an embrace that felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. Later that night, as Emma lay in the bed that was now truly hers in the room that would always be her sanctuary, she thought about the remarkable chain of events that had brought her to this moment. Papa's death had seemed like the end of everything, the destruction of the only life she'd ever known. But it had actually been the beginning of something better, something she never could have imagined when she was stumbling through the storm with nowhere to go. Outside her window, the Montana landscape stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars that had witnessed countless stories of loss and redemption, endings that became beginnings, strangers who became family. And in the distance, she could hear Bella nickering softly in the corral, another lost soul who had found safety and belonging at the Double H Ranch. Emma Harrison, and she could finally think of herself by that name without qualification, closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the sounds of home and the unshakable knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The late October wind carried the scent of approaching winter across the Montana plains. As Emma Harrison, she still felt a thrill every time she thought her new name helped Clara preserve the last of the season's vegetables in the ranch kitchen. 2 months had passed since her adoption was finalized, and life at the Double H Ranch had settled into comfortable rhythms that felt as natural as breathing. But this particular morning brought an interruption that would challenge everything Emma had come to believe about her newfound security. A rider approached the ranch at full gallop, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with the kind of urgency that meant serious trouble somewhere. "Samuel," the rider called out as he dismounted near the porch. "Samuel Harrison, I need to speak with you right away." Emma recognized the man as Tom Bradley, who owned the neighboring spread 5 miles to the east. Bradley was known throughout the territory as a steady, reliable rancher who rarely got excited about anything, which made his obvious agitation all the more alarming. Samuel emerged from the barn where he'd been working with Bella, his face immediately shifting into the alert expression of someone preparing for bad news. Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, while Emma positioned herself where she could hear the conversation without appearing to eavesdrop. "What's the trouble, Tom?" Samuel asked, accepting the traditional cup of coffee that Clara automatically offered to any visitor, regardless of the circumstances. "It's about the child," Bradley said without preamble, his eyes flicking toward Emma with an expression she couldn't quite read. "The one you took in. There's been talk, Samuel. Questions being raised about the whole situation." Emma's blood turned to ice water as she processed Bradley's words. Questions about her situation could only mean one thing: someone was challenging the adoption, investigating her background, potentially threatening the family bond that had become the center of her world. What kind of questions? Samuel's voice remained calm, but Emma could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand moved instinctively to rest on the porch railing as if bracing himself for impact. Sheriff Martinez got a letter 3 days ago, Bradley continued, lowering his voice but not enough to prevent Emma from hearing every word. From some relatives back east, claiming they're the child's legal guardians. Seems they just heard about her father's death and want her brought to live with them in Philadelphia. The world seemed to tilt sideways beneath Emma's feet. Relatives? She had no relatives except for the mythical Aunt Margaret in Oregon, who might not even exist. Papa had been very clear about that. They were alone in the world, just the two of them against whatever came. That's impossible, Clara said firmly, stepping fully onto the porch with the kind of protective energy Emma had come to associate with lionesses defending their cubs. Emma told us she had no family except for a possible aunt somewhere out west. She would have known if there were relatives back east. Bradley shrugged uncomfortably, clearly wishing he didn't have to be the bearer of such disturbing news. Maybe she knew, maybe she didn't. But these folks have documentation, birth certificates, family records, letters from her father dating back years. They claim Joseph Walsh was their nephew, and that makes Emma their responsibility. Emma's mind raced as she tried to process this information. Papa had never mentioned relatives in Philadelphia, had never spoken of anyone who might have claimed to her if something happened to him. But then again, Papa had been a private man who kept his own counsel about many things. It was possible, terrifying, but possible, that he had family connections he'd never shared with her. What does Sheriff Martinez want to do about it? Samuel asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't be good. He's got no choice but to investigate, Bradley replied reluctantly. These people have hired lawyers, Samuel. They're claiming the adoption was illegal because proper searches weren't conducted for living relatives. They want the child returned to them immediately, and they're prepared to go to court to make it happen. The conversation continued around Emma, but she barely heard the details about legal procedures and jurisdictional questions. All she could think about was the possibility of being torn away from the Harrisons, sent to live with strangers who might have legal claims but no emotional connection to her well-being. She thought about the children she'd known at Papa's funeral, distant relatives who had appeared briefly to pay respects and then disappeared again, showing polite concern, but no real involvement in the aftermath of loss. Were these the same kinds of people? Relatives who had ignored Papa's struggles for years, but now wanted to claim his daughter out of some sense of duty or obligation. The worst part was the uncertainty. If these people really were family, if they had legitimate legal standing, then everything Emma had built with the Harrisons could be swept away, regardless of what any of them wanted. Love and commitment might not be enough to overcome the cold mechanics of law and legal guardianship. After Bradley left with promises to keep Samuel informed of any developments, the Harrison family gathered around their kitchen table for what felt like a war council. The easy domesticity of the morning had been replaced by tense silence as all three of them tried to process the implications of this unexpected threat. "We'll fight this," Samuel said finally, his voice carrying the kind of quiet determination that had built the Double H Ranch from raw wilderness. "We'll get our own lawyers, challenge their documentation, prove that Emma belongs here with us." "But what if we can't?" Emma asked quietly, the question that all of them were thinking, but none had wanted to voice. "What if they really are family? What if the law says I have to go with them?" Clara reached across the table to take Emma's hands, her grip firm and reassuring despite the obvious worry in her eyes. Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, sweetheart. But we're not giving up without a fight. You're our daughter now, legally, and in every other way that matters. That has to count for something." The next 3 weeks were among the most difficult of Emma's young life, worse in some ways than the immediate aftermath of Papa's death. At least then, her situation had been clear. She was alone and had to find a way to survive. Now she was caught in legal limbo, belonging fully to a family that might not have the right to keep her. Waiting for strangers to decide her fate based on documents and precedents rather than love and commitment. The Philadelphia relatives, it turned out, were Papa's sister Martha and her husband Edward Whitman, wealthy merchants who had cut off contact with Joseph Walsh years earlier, when he decided to seek his fortune in the Western Territories rather than join the family business. They had ignored his letters asking for help during the lean years, had shown no interest in Emma's existence while Papa was alive, but now claimed they were duty-bound to provide for his orphaned daughter. Their lawyer, a sharp-tongued man named Harrison Blackwood, who specialized in custody disputes, painted the Harrisons as well-meaning but unsuitable guardians who had overstepped their authority in adopting a child without proper legal procedures. He questioned Samuel's ability to provide the kind of educational and social advantages that Emma would receive in Philadelphia, suggested that ranch life was too rough and isolated for a girl who deserved refined society and cultural opportunities. Most damaging of all, Blackwood argued that Emma's own testimony about her circumstances couldn't be trusted. She was, he claimed, a traumatized child who had been essentially kidnapped by grief and desperation, unable to make rational decisions about her own future. Her attachment to the Harrisons was nothing more than Stockholm Syndrome, the natural result of being dependent on people who had shown her kindness when she was most vulnerable. The accusations stung not because they were entirely false, but because they contained just enough truth to be believable. Emma had been traumatized, had been dependent on the Harrisons' kindness, had formed attachments based initially on gratitude and necessity. But what Blackwood couldn't see or chose to ignore was how those initial circumstances had evolved into genuine love and belonging. Emma found herself questioned by court officials, examined by doctors who were supposed to determine her mental and physical well-being, and evaluated by social workers who made notes about her responses to carefully crafted questions designed to reveal her true feelings about her living situation. Through it all, she tried to remain calm and truthful, to explain that while she appreciated her aunt and uncle's concern, she had already found the family she needed and wanted to stay exactly where she was. But she could see the doubt in some of the officials' eyes, the assumption that a child her age couldn't possibly understand the long-term implications of her choices. The crisis came to a head on a cold November morning when Sheriff Martinez arrived at the ranch with official papers requiring Emma to accompany him to town for a formal custody hearing. The Whitmans had arrived from Philadelphia the day before, prepared to take immediate custody of their niece, pending the court's final decision. Emma's first glimpse of Martha and Edward Whitman confirmed her worst fears about their motivations. They were well-dressed, obviously prosperous people who spoke in the refined accents of educated society, but there was something cold and calculating in their manner that suggested duty rather than affection drove their actions. Martha Whitman was a thin, sharp-featured woman in her 50s who examined Emma with the critical eye of someone evaluating a piece of property. Her first words were not greetings or expressions of sympathy for Emma's loss, but complaints about the child's appearance and manners. "Good heavens," Martha said, looking Emma up and down with obvious disapproval. "Look how brown she's gotten from all this outdoor work. And that dress homemade, obviously. The child looks like a farm laborer rather than a young lady of good family." Edward Whitman was equally concerned with appearances, questioning Samuel about Emma's education and expressing horror that she had been doing manual labor around the ranch rather than focusing on accomplishments appropriate to her gender and social standing. She should be studying French and piano, he declared pompously, learning deportment and needlework, preparing for the kind of marriage that will secure her future in proper society. Instead, she's been running wild like some frontier savage, developing habits and attitudes that will take years to correct. Emma listened to these criticisms with growing anger and disgust. These people saw her as a project to be reformed rather than a person to be loved, a reflection of their own social standing rather than an individual with her own thoughts and preferences. The idea of spending even a week in their custody, much less the years until she came of age, filled her with despair. But the most crushing blow came when their lawyer presented evidence that seemed to support the Whitmans' case. Birth certificates proving Joseph Walsh was Martha's brother. Letters he had written years earlier, asking for financial help and acknowledging his sister's superior wisdom about child-rearing. Legal documents showing the Whitmans' financial stability and social connections. Against this mountain of official evidence, the Harrisons could offer only their love for Emma and her obvious attachment to them. In the cold calculus of legal decision-making, that might not be enough to overcome questions about proper procedures and biological family claims. As they sat in the courthouse waiting for the judge to make his decision, Emma realized that all the security she had found over the past months might vanish in the space of a single legal ruling. The family she had chosen, the home she had claimed, the future she had dared to envision, all of it hung in the balance, while strangers debated what would be best for her without really understanding who she was or what she needed. The only question now was whether love and commitment would prove stronger than law and convention, whether the bonds of choice could overcome the claims of blood and legal precedent. Emma closed her eyes and prayed to whatever forces governed justice and mercy, that the family she had found would be allowed to keep the daughter they had claimed. The courthouse in Cedar Falls was a modest building by Eastern standards, but it represented the highest authority in this corner of Montana territory. As Emma sat between Samuel and Clara on the hard wooden bench, she felt the weight of everything she'd gained and might lose pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Judge William Morrison, the same man who had formalized her adoption, just months earlier presided over the proceedings with the grave demeanor of someone who understood that his decision would fundamentally alter a child's life. His weathered face revealed nothing as lawyers on both sides presented their cases, each side painting vastly different pictures of what would be best for Emma's future. Harrison Blackwood, representing the Whitmans, spoke with the polished confidence of a man accustomed to winning difficult cases. He painted a picture of Emma as a victim of circumstance who deserved the educational and cultural opportunities that only her blood relatives could provide. "Your Honor," Blackwood intoned, his voice carrying the authority of expensive education and courtroom experience, "we are not here to question the good intentions of Mr. and Mrs. Harrison. Indeed, their kindness toward this child during her time of greatest need speaks well of their character. However, good intentions cannot substitute for proper legal procedures, family connections, and the advantages that come with legitimate guardianship." He gestured toward the Whitmans, who sat primly in the front row wearing their finest clothes like armor against the crude realities of frontier justice. Mr. and Mrs. Whitman represent stability, refinement, and the kind of social connections that will ensure Emma receives not just basic care, but the education and cultural refinement appropriate to a young lady of good breeding. They can provide her with music lessons, proper schooling, exposure to art and literature, advantages that no ranch, however well-intentioned, can offer. Emma watched the judge's face as Blackwood spoke, searching for any sign of how these arguments were being received. Judge Morrison had seemed to understand her genuine feelings during the adoption proceedings, but now he wore the impassive mask of legal authority that revealed nothing of his personal opinions. Furthermore, Blackwood continued, warming to his theme, "we must consider the questionable circumstances under which this adoption took place. No proper search was conducted for living relatives. No attempt was made to contact Emma's extended family. The Harrisons, however well-meaning, essentially took advantage of a traumatized child's desperation to create a legal relationship that bypassed established procedures designed to protect children's true interests. The words stung because they contained just enough truth to be credible. Emma had been desperate, had been traumatized, had formed her attachment to the Harrisons under circumstances that could be interpreted as taking advantage of her vulnerability. But what Blackwood couldn't see or chose to ignore was that desperation and trauma hadn't blinded her to the quality of care she was receiving. If anything, her difficult circumstances had made her more perceptive about the difference between genuine love and mere obligation. When it came time for the Harrisons' lawyer, a local attorney named Daniel Mackenzie, to present their case, Emma felt a flutter of anxiety. Mackenzie was competent and well-respected in the territory, but he lacked Blackwood's polished eloquence and extensive experience with custody disputes. Against the mountain of documentation and legal precedent that the Whitmans had assembled, what could Mackenzie offer except emotional appeals that might not carry weight in a court of law? But Mackenzie surprised everyone by taking an approach that focused not on legal technicalities, but on the fundamental question of what actually served a child's best interests. "Your Honor," Mackenzie began, his voice carrying the straightforward sincerity of a man who had built his reputation on honest dealing rather than clever arguments. "The opposing counsel speaks eloquently about advantages and opportunities, about proper procedures and social connections. But they have overlooked the most important factor in this entire case, what Emma herself wants and needs." He turned to gesture toward Emma, and she felt every eye in the courtroom focusing on her with uncomfortable intensity. "This young lady has experienced more loss and hardship in her 12 years than many adults face in a lifetime. She lost her father, lost her home, lost everything familiar and secure in her world. When she found herself alone and frightened, she didn't seek out the finest house in town or the wealthiest family. She sought shelter and safety, and she found both with Samuel and Clara Harrison." Mackenzie moved closer to the judge's bench, his manner becoming more conversational, as if he were discussing the matter with a neighbor over coffee rather than arguing before a court of law. "The opposing counsel suggests that Emma's attachment to the Harrisons is somehow artificial, the result of trauma rather than genuine affection. But I would argue that trauma makes us more discerning about who we trust, not less. A child who has lost everything learns quickly to distinguish between people who care about her welfare and people who see her as an obligation or an opportunity." Emma felt her heart begin to beat faster as she realized that Mackenzie was building towards something. An argument she hadn't expected, but desperately hoped might prove persuasive. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Emma Harrison to testify on her own behalf." The request sent a murmur through the courthouse. It was unusual for children Emma's age to testify in custody proceedings, based on the assumption that they couldn't fully understand the long-term implications of their choices. But Judge Morrison, after a moment's consideration, nodded his agreement. "Miss Emma," he said gently as she approached the witness stand with trembling legs, "you understand that you're here to tell the truth about your situation and your feelings about where you want to live?" "Yes, sir," Emma replied, her voice barely above a whisper as she tried to summon the courage she would need for what might be the most important conversation of her life. Mackenzie approached her with the same gentle manner he might use with a frightened animal, understanding that the wrong tone or approach could undermine everything they hoped to accomplish. "Emma, can you tell the court about your life before you came to live with the Harrisons?" Emma took a deep breath and began to speak about Papa's illness, about the long months of watching him grow weaker while they struggled to survive on charity and hope. She spoke about the morning he died, about the terrible silence that followed, about her decision to leave rather than wait for others to decide her fate. "I knew about the county orphanage," she said, her voice growing stronger as she found her rhythm. I knew about the children who went there and came out broken, trained for nothing but the hardest work and the lowest expectations. I didn't want that life, and Papa didn't want it for me either. And when you arrived at the Harrison Ranch, what did you find there? I found people who saw me as a person instead of a problem, Emma replied without hesitation. Mr. and Mrs. Harrison didn't just give me food and shelter. They gave me a place to belong, room to grow, the chance to become whoever I was meant to be, instead of just whoever was convenient for them. Blackwood objected that Emma was too young to understand the implications of her choices, but Judge Morrison overruled him and allowed her to continue. Emma, Mackenzie said carefully, you've now met your aunt and uncle from Philadelphia. Can you tell the court about that meeting? Emma glanced toward the Whitmans, who were watching her with expressions that mixed disapproval with calculation. She thought about Martha's immediate criticisms of her appearance, Edward's horror at her ranch work, their obvious intention to remake her into someone more suitable to their social expectations. They seem like proper people, Emma said diplomatically. But they don't know me. They look at me and see someone who needs to be fixed, someone whose choices have all been wrong. They want to change everything about how I live and who I am, and they call it giving me advantages. And how do you feel about that? Emma's answer came from the deepest part of her heart, the place where she had learned to distinguish between genuine care and mere obligation. I feel like they want to save me from a life that's made me happier than I've ever been. They want to give me things I don't want and take away things I can't bear to lose. They see Samuel and Clara Harrison as people who aren't good enough to raise me, but those people have been the best parents anyone could ask for. The courtroom fell silent as Emma's words sank in. Even the Whitmans seemed taken aback by the passion and clarity of her testimony. This wasn't the confused, traumatized child they had expected, but a young woman who understood exactly what she was choosing and why. But Blackwood wasn't finished. When it came time for cross-examination, he approached Emma with the patronizing manner of an adult who believed children's opinions were inherently unreliable. Emma, you're very young to be making such important decisions about your future. Don't you think adults with more experience might know better what's good for you? In the long run? I think, Emma replied steadily, that the adults who have actually taken care of me know better than the adults who ignored me until it became convenient to notice me. The response drew a sharp intake of breath from several spectators, and even Judge Morrison seemed surprised by Emma's directness. Blackwood tried a different approach. Your aunt and uncle can give you educational opportunities that ranch life simply cannot provide. Don't you want to learn music, art, literature? Don't you want to be prepared for a refined life and proper society? Emma considered the question carefully before answering. I've learned more about music from listening to Samuel sing to the horses than I ever could from formal lessons. I've learned more about art from watching Clara arrange flowers and tend her garden than from any painting in a museum. And I've learned more about literature from the stories we tell each other by the fire than from any fancy books. She paused, gathering courage for what she knew would be her most important statement. But even if that weren't true, even if Philadelphia could give me every advantage in the world, it still wouldn't matter. Because advantages don't mean anything if you're not happy, if you don't feel loved, if you're living with people who see you as a responsibility instead of a blessing. The silence that followed Emma's testimony was profound. Even Blackwood seemed momentarily at a loss for words, while the Whitmans exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand that their case might not be as strong as they had assumed. Judge Morrison called for a recess to consider the testimony, leaving Emma and the Harrisons to wait in agonizing uncertainty, while strangers debated whether love and commitment would prove stronger than law and social convention. As they sat together on the courthouse steps during the break, Clara took Emma's hands in her own weathered ones. Whatever happens in there, Clara said quietly, you should know that these past months have been the greatest blessing of our lives. You've given us more than we could ever give you. "That's not true," Emma replied, leaning against Clara's shoulder with the easy affection of a daughter who had never doubted her welcome. "You gave me everything, a home, a family, a future. But most of all, you gave me the right to choose that future for myself." Samuel cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion when he spoke. "Whatever the judge decides, you'll always be our daughter, Emma. Law can't change that, and neither can distance or time." As they sat together in the afternoon sunlight, Emma realized that regardless of what happened next, she had already won the most important victory. She had found people who loved her not for what she represented or what she could become, but for exactly who she was. That knowledge would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead, whether they faced them together or apart. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows when Judge Morrison returned to his bench after what felt like an eternity of deliberation. Emma sat rigidly between Samuel and Clara, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Every person in the courtroom seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the words that would determine the course of a young girl's life. Judge Morrison's weathered face revealed nothing as he shuffled through the papers before him, taking his time to review the testimonies and evidence one final time. When he finally looked up, his eyes moved slowly around the courtroom, taking in the tense faces of the Whitmans, the anxious expressions of the Harrisons, and finally settling on Emma herself. "This case," he began, his voice carrying the weight of careful consideration, "presents questions that go to the very heart of what we mean when we speak of a child's best interests. On one side, we have blood relatives who offer educational advantages, social connections, and the material benefits that come with established wealth and position. On the other side, we have chosen family who offer love, stability, and the kind of emotional security that no amount of money can purchase." Emma felt her heart hammering against her ribs as the judge continued his preliminary remarks. She tried to read his expression, to find some hint of which way his decision would lean, but Judge Morrison maintained the impassive demeanor of a man who had learned to keep his personal feelings separate from his legal responsibilities. "The law generally favors placement with blood relatives when such placement is available and appropriate," Morrison continued, and Emma felt the floor seem to drop away beneath her feet. "However, the law also requires that we consider the totality of circumstances, including the child's own expressed preferences, when that child demonstrates sufficient maturity to understand the implications of those preferences." A murmur ran through the courtroom as people tried to interpret the significance of the judge's words. Was he preparing to award custody to the Whitmans based on legal precedent, or was he building toward a different conclusion? "I have reviewed the evidence presented by both sides," Morrison said, his tone becoming more decisive. "The Whitmans have indeed produced documentation establishing their blood relationship to Emma Walsh. They have demonstrated their financial capability to provide for her material needs and educational advancement. Their attorney has made compelling arguments about the advantages of urban life and refined society." Emma's spirit sank lower with each word that seemed to favor the Philadelphia relatives. She glanced toward the Whitmans and saw Martha sitting with the satisfied expression of someone who expected vindication, while Edward nodded smugly at each point the judge made in their favor. "However," Judge Morrison continued, and that single word seemed to shift the entire atmosphere in the room, "I have also been struck by the testimony of the child herself. Emma Harrison, and I use that name deliberately, has demonstrated remarkable maturity and clarity about her own situation and needs. Her testimony revealed not the confused gratitude of a traumatized child, but the considered judgment of a young person who understands the difference between material advantages and genuine care." Emma felt a flutter of hope begin to stir in her chest, though she tried not to let herself believe too much in case disappointment followed. The court has also observed the relationship between Emma and her adoptive parents. The bond between them is clearly genuine, built on mutual affection and respect rather than mere legal obligation. Samuel and Clara Harrison have not only provided Emma with material care, but have nurtured her emotional development and respected her individual personality in ways that speak to exemplary parenting. Judge Morrison paused to take a drink of water, and in that silence, Emma could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears like thunder. In contrast, the judge continued, the court notes that Mr. and Mrs. Whitman, while undoubtedly well-intentioned, approached this child as a project to be reformed rather than a person to be cherished. Their immediate criticisms of Emma's appearance and manner, their obvious intention to remake her according to their own social expectations, suggest a fundamental misunderstanding of what constitutes proper child rearing. Martha Whitman's composed expression began to crack as she realized the direction of the judge's reasoning. Her lawyer, Harrison Blackwood, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly recognizing that his careful legal arguments were being outweighed by considerations he hadn't anticipated. Furthermore, Morrison continued, the court must consider the circumstances under which the Whitmans' claim has arisen. They had no contact with Joseph Walsh during his years of struggle and hardship. They showed no interest in Emma's welfare, while her father was alive and in need of family support. Their sudden appearance after his death, coinciding with their discovery that Emma had been placed with a loving family, raises questions about their true motivations. Emma felt tears beginning to blur her vision, but these were tears of relief rather than despair. For the first time since this legal challenge had begun, she dared to hope that common sense and human understanding might prevail over technical legal requirements. The court finds, Judge Morrison said, his voice becoming formal as he approached his official ruling, that while the Whitmans are indeed Emma's blood relatives and have demonstrated their financial capability to provide for her material needs, they have failed to demonstrate that their custody would serve her best interests when measured against the love, stability, and genuine family bonds she has already established with Samuel and Clara Harrison. The words hit Emma like a physical blow of pure joy. She felt Clara's arm tighten around her shoulders, while Samuel's large hand found hers and squeezed with gentle strength. Therefore, the judge continued, the court rules that the adoption of Emma Walsh by Samuel and Clara Harrison was conducted properly under territorial law and shall remain in full effect. The petition by Mr. and Mrs. Whitman for custody is denied. The courthouse erupted in a mixture of cheers from Harrison supporters and angry protests from the Whitman side. Emma found herself enveloped in Clara's fierce embrace while Samuel's weathered face broke into a grin that transformed his entire appearance. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. He raised his hand for silence, and the courtroom gradually quieted to hear his final remarks. However, he said, his tone becoming more conciliatory, the court encouraged the Harrison family to maintain communication with the Whitmans if they desire ongoing contact with their niece. Blood relationships, even when they cannot serve as the basis for custody, may still provide Emma with connections to her father's family history and heritage. It was a gracious gesture designed to soften the blow of defeat for the Whitmans while acknowledging that family connections could take many forms. Emma appreciated the judge's diplomacy, though she privately doubted that Martha and Edward Whitman would be interested in any relationship that didn't grant them control over her upbringing. As the courtroom began to empty and people offered their congratulations to the Harrison family, Emma caught sight of Martha Whitman's face. The older woman looked genuinely shocked by the outcome, as if she had never seriously considered the possibility that blood relationship and social advantage might not automatically prevail over chosen family and genuine affection. For a moment, Emma felt a flutter of sympathy for her aunt. Martha had undoubtedly believed she was doing the right thing, offering opportunities and advantages that she genuinely thought would benefit her brother's daughter. The fact that Emma preferred the life she had found with the Harrisons probably seemed incomprehensible to someone who measured success by social position and material accumulation. But that sympathy was tempered by Emma's clear understanding of what life with the Whitmans would have meant: constant criticism of her choices and preferences, relentless pressure to conform to social expectations that felt artificial and constraining, and the loss of the freedom to develop into whoever she was meant to become. Outside the courthouse, the Harrison family stood together in the late afternoon sunlight, still somewhat stunned by the magnitude of what had just occurred. Emma realized that she had been holding her breath for weeks, unable to fully believe in the security of her new life while the legal challenge hung over them. Now, with the judge's ruling official and final, she could finally exhale and accept that she truly belonged exactly where she was. "I can't believe it's really over," Clara said, her voice shaky with relief and residual anxiety. "I kept thinking something would go wrong, that they'd find some legal technicality we hadn't considered." "It's over," Samuel confirmed, his arm encircling both his wife and daughter with the protective gesture that had become second nature to him. "Emma's ours, legally and officially and permanently. Nobody can change that now." As they walked toward their wagon for the ride home to the Double H Ranch, Emma found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a frightened child fleeing through a storm with nothing but a canvas bag and desperate hope. Today, she was a legally recognized member of a family that had chosen to love her, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The transformation still amazed her sometimes. She thought about the girl who had asked to sleep in a barn, who had been so grateful for basic shelter and safety that she could barely imagine asking for more. That girl could never have envisioned standing in a courtroom defending her right to remain with the people who had become her true family. But perhaps the most remarkable change wasn't in her external circumstances, but in her understanding of what family actually meant. She had been born into a family with Papa, had loved and been loved within the bonds of blood relationship. But she had chosen the Harrisons, and they had chosen her, creating something that felt even stronger because it was built on mutual decision rather than biological accident. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked as they settled into the wagon for the ride home. "I'm thinking about choices," Emma replied, leaning against Clara's shoulder with the easy affection that had replaced her initial wariness. "About how sometimes the best things in life are the ones we choose for ourselves rather than the ones that are chosen for us." Samuel chuckled from the driver's seat as he urged the horses into motion. Wise words from a 12-year-old. "Though, I guess you've had to grow up faster than most children your age." "Maybe," Emma agreed, "but I don't mind. Growing up meant learning to recognize genuine love when I found it. And it meant learning to fight for the things that really matter." As the wagon rolled through the Montana landscape toward home, Emma allowed herself to fully appreciate the victory they had won. Not just the legal victory that confirmed her place in the Harrison family, but the deeper victory of proving that chosen love could be stronger than legal obligation. That the bonds of the heart could overcome the claims of blood and social convention. The ranch buildings came into view as the sun began to set behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Emma of the morning she had first seen this place through the storm. Everything looked exactly the same as when they had left that morning, but somehow it all felt different, now more solid, more permanent, more truly home. Bella nickered a greeting from the corral as they pulled into the yard, and Emma realized that even the horses seemed to sense that something important had been settled. This was her place, her family, her chosen life, and no one could ever take it away from her again. That night, as she lay in the bed that was truly and permanently hers, Emma whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever forces had guided her through the storm to the people who would become her salvation. She had asked only for shelter in a barn, but she had received so much more: a family, a future, and the knowledge that sometimes the worst day of your life could be the first day of your best life, if you were brave enough to accept the gifts. that unexpected kindness could offer. Spring came early to Montana that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal and possibility that seemed to mirror the changes in Emma's life. 6 months had passed since the court victory that had permanently secured her place in the Harrison family, and life at the Double H Ranch had settled into rhythms that felt as natural and enduring as the seasonal cycles of the land itself. This particular morning brought visitors that would challenge Emma's newfound security in ways she never could have anticipated. She was working in Clara's vegetable garden, preparing the soil for the spring planting, when the sound of multiple horses approaching made her look up from her task. What she saw made her heart skip with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. 3 riders were making their way up the trail to the ranch house, and even from a distance, Emma could tell that these weren't ordinary visitors. Their horses were too fine, their clothing too formal, their entire bearing too purposeful for casual callers. More unsettling still, one of the riders was a woman traveling side saddle, an unusual sight in this part of the territory, where practical considerations usually trumped social conventions. Samuel emerged from the barn, his attention drawn by the same sound that had alerted Emma. Clara appeared on the porch, shading her eyes against the morning sun as she tried to identify their unexpected guests. All 3 members of the Harrison family shared the wariness that came from hard-won experience in their world. Unexpected visitors often brought unexpected problems. As the riders drew closer, Emma recognized the lead figure as someone she had hoped never to see again. Harrison Blackwood, the sharp-tongued lawyer who had represented the Whitmans during the custody battle, sat his horse with the same arrogant confidence he had displayed in the courtroom. Beside him rode a middle-aged man in expensive Eastern clothing, while the woman brought up the rear with the careful posture of someone unaccustomed to long-distance riding. "Mr. Harrison," Blackwood called out as he dismounted near the porch, his voice carrying the same condescending tone that had characterized his courtroom performance. "I trust you remember me. I've brought some people who are very interested in meeting young Emma." Samuel stepped protectively closer to where Emma stood frozen in the garden, his body language making it clear that he was prepared to defend his daughter against whatever new threat these visitors might represent. "Mr. Blackwood," Samuel replied, carefully, his voice neutral but alert. "I thought our business was concluded. The court's decision was final." "Oh, it was indeed," Blackwood agreed with a smile that held no warmth. "But circumstances have changed since that ruling. New information has come to light that puts an entirely different complexion on Emma's situation." The middle-aged man dismounted and approached with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to having his wishes granted without question. Everything about him, from his perfectly groomed appearance to his expensive watch chain, proclaimed wealth and social position. "Allow me to introduce myself," the man said with a slight bow that managed to be both polite and condescending. "I am Charles Pemberton, headmaster of the Pemberton Academy for Young Ladies in Boston. This is my assistant, Miss Adelaide Hartwell, who serves as our placement coordinator." Emma felt a chill run down her spine at the formal introduction. An academy for young ladies, a placement coordinator. The language was polite, but the implications were ominous. These people weren't here as casual visitors or even potential friends. They represented some kind of institution, some organized system that wanted something from her. "And what brings you to our ranch, Mr. Pemberton?" Clara asked, stepping down from the porch to stand beside her husband and daughter. Her voice carried the protective edge of a mother bear confronting a potential threat to her cub. "We're here about Emma's education," Miss Hartwell announced, speaking for the first time since their arrival. She was a thin, severe-looking woman with steel-gray hair and the kind of permanently disapproving expression that suggested she found fault with most things in the world. "We've been informed that a young lady of unusual intelligence and character is receiving inadequate instruction in this rustic environment." The words hit Emma like physical blows. These strangers had presumed to judge her life, her family, her education, and her environment without knowing anything about who she was or what she needed. More troubling still, someone had provided them with information about her, but who? And why? Emma receives excellent instruction, Samuel said firmly. She reads well above her grade level, excels at mathematics, and has practical skills that serve her far better than any abstract classroom learning could. Blackwood laughed, a sound that held no humor. Reading frontier newspapers and learning to milk cows hardly constitutes the education appropriate for a young lady of Emma's. Unique circumstances. What unique circumstances? Emma demanded, finding her voice at last. She stepped forward, no longer content to let the adults discuss her as if she weren't present. What gives you the right to judge my education or my circumstances? Miss Hartwell looked at Emma with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating livestock at market. My dear child, you clearly don't understand the opportunities being offered to you. The Pemberton Academy is the finest institution of its kind in New England. Our graduates marry into the best families, move in the highest social circles, enjoy advantages that girls of your current situation could never imagine. I don't want those advantages, Emma replied steadily. I'm happy exactly where I am, with exactly the life I have. Happiness, Pemberton interjected with dismissive authority, is a luxury that young people are rarely qualified to evaluate. What matters is preparation for a productive and appropriate adult life. And I'm afraid that frontier ranch life, however pleasant it might seem to a child, simply cannot provide that preparation. Clara stepped closer to Emma, her protective instincts fully aroused. And who, exactly, appointed you to judge what's appropriate for our daughter? The question hung in the air for a moment, before Blackwood reached into his jacket and withdrew a thick envelope. I'm glad you asked, Mrs. Harrison. As it happens, we have documentation that significantly alters Emma's legal status. Emma's blood turned to ice as she watched Blackwood extract a sheaf of official-looking papers. The last time he had produced documents, they had nearly resulted in her being sent away with the Whitmans. What new legal trap had he constructed now? It seems, Blackwood continued with obvious satisfaction, that Emma's father was not quite as isolated as everyone believed. Before his death, Joseph Walsh entered into a contract with a charitable foundation that provides educational opportunities for orphan children of exceptional promise. He handed the papers to Samuel, who accepted them with obvious reluctance. The Walsh Educational Trust, established by Joseph Walsh himself, specifically designates that should anything happen to him, Emma would receive a full scholarship to Collar, the finest educational institution available. All expenses paid, of course, including clothing, books, and social preparation appropriate to a young lady of refined breeding. Emma felt the world tilting beneath her feet as she tried to process this information. Papa had never mentioned any educational trust, any plans for her future beyond their simple life together. But then again, Papa had been a man who kept his deepest worries to himself, who might well have made arrangements he hoped would never be necessary. This is the first we've heard of any such trust, Samuel said, scanning the documents with the careful attention of someone looking for legal traps. Why is this information only surfacing now, months after Emma's adoption was finalized? The trust was administered by a law firm in Denver, Miss Hartwell explained with the patience of someone addressing particularly slow students. When Joseph Walsh died, it took time for the proper notifications to work their way through legal channels. The firm only recently learned of Emma's current situation and contacted the appropriate educational institutions. And why? Clara asked. With growing suspicion, did these educational institutions contact the same lawyer who represented the Whitmans in their failed custody attempt? Blackwood's smile grew broader, as if he had been waiting for exactly that question. Because the Whitmans, despite their disappointment over the custody ruling, remained concerned about Emma's welfare. When they learned of this educational opportunity, they felt obligated to ensure that Emma received the benefits her father intended for her. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place in Emma's mind, creating a picture that filled her with anger and dismay. The Whitmans, frustrated by their legal defeat, had found another way to interfere in her life. They couldn't gain custody, but they could try to separate her from the Harrison family through appeals to duty and her father's supposed intentions. "I don't believe Papa made any such arrangements," Emma said firmly, stepping forward to face Blackwood directly. "He would have told me about something that important. He would have prepared me for it, would he?" Pemberton asked with infuriating condescension. Or would a loving father have preferred to spare his daughter the burden of worrying about a future that might never come to pass? Parents often make provisions for their children's welfare without burdening them with the details. The argument was compelling enough to plant seeds of doubt in Emma's mind. Papa had been protective, had often shielded her from his deepest worries about their financial situation and uncertain future. It was possible, just possible, that he had made arrangements he hoped would never be necessary. But even if that were true, even if Papa had established some kind of educational trust, that didn't mean she was obligated to honor provisions made without her knowledge or consent. She was no longer the desperate, powerless child who had fled through the storm 6 months ago. She was Emma Harrison, beloved daughter of Samuel and Clara, with the legal right to remain with the family. She had chosen. "Even if this trust exists," she said carefully, "even if Papa made these arrangements, that doesn't mean I have to accept them. I'm happy with my education and my life exactly as they are." Miss Hartwell's expression grew even more disapproving. "My dear child, you simply don't understand what you're refusing. The Pemberton Academy opens doors that remain forever closed to girls without proper educational credentials. Our graduates move in society, marry well, enjoy lives of refinement and cultural advancement. Are you really prepared to sacrifice all of that for the limited opportunities of frontier life?" "I'm prepared to sacrifice anything," Emma replied, without hesitation, "to remain with the people who love me and want me to be happy rather than impressive." The conversation might have continued indefinitely, with both sides restating their positions with increasing firmness, but it was interrupted by the arrival of another rider approaching at considerable speed. This newcomer was someone Emma recognized. With relief, Sheriff Martinez, whose presence suggested that official authority would finally be brought to bear on whatever legal maneuvering Blackwood and his associates were attempting. "Mr. Harrison," Martinez called out as he dismounted, "I got word that you might be having some difficulties with uninvited visitors making legal claims about your daughter." "We're having difficulties with people who refuse to accept that Emma's future has already been decided," Samuel replied grimly. "People who think they can manufacture legal obligations to overturn a court's ruling." Martinez turned his attention to Blackwood with the sort of professional wariness that experienced lawmen develop when dealing with lawyers who specialize in finding loopholes in established decisions. "Mr. Blackwood, I trust you have proper documentation for whatever claims you're making here today. Because if you're attempting to circumvent Judge Morrison's custody ruling through false pretenses, that would constitute a very serious legal violation." For the first time since his arrival, Blackwood looked less than completely confident. The presence of local law enforcement, combined with the sheriff's obvious skepticism about his motives, had shifted the balance of power in the confrontation. Emma realized that this was her moment to take control of the situation, to speak for herself with the same clarity and conviction that had carried the day during the custody hearing. "Sheriff Martinez," she said, stepping forward with the poise she had learned through months of being treated as a valued member of the Harrison family, "these people claim my father established an educational trust that requires me to attend their academy in Boston. Even if that's true, I want it clearly understood that I have no intention of leaving my family or my home. Whatever arrangements Papa may have made were based on circumstances that no longer exist." The declaration sent ripples of reaction through the assembled group, but Emma wasn't finished. She had learned from her courtroom experience that sometimes the most important battles were won not through legal maneuvering, but through moral clarity and the courage to stand up for what was right. This was one of those battles, and she intended to win it. Sheriff Martinez studied the documents that Blackwood had produced with the methodical attention of a man who had seen enough forged papers to recognize the signs. His weathered fingers traced over the signatures and seals, his experienced eye-catching details that would escape most people's notice. The silence that stretched across the ranch yard grew heavier with each passing moment as everyone waited for his professional assessment of the supposed educational trust. Emma watched the sheriff's face intently, searching for any hint of what his examination might reveal. Her entire future seemed to hang in the balance once again, dependent on the authenticity of papers that could either validate or destroy the claims being made against her chosen family. The familiar knot of anxiety that had plagued her during the custody battle began to tighten in her stomach, even though she knew she was stronger now than she had been then. "These documents are very interesting," Martinez said finally, his tone carrying the careful neutrality of a lawman who had learned to present evidence methodically rather than dramatically. "But they contain several irregularities that raise serious questions about their authenticity." Blackwood shifted uncomfortably, his confident demeanor showing the first cracks it had displayed since his arrival. "What kind of irregularities, Sheriff?" "I can assure you that the trust documentation is completely legitimate." "Well, for starters," Martinez replied, holding up one of the papers so that everyone could see the official-looking seals and signatures, "the notarization appears to have been performed by the Denver law firm of Hutchinson, Bradley, and Associates. The problem is, that firm went out of business in 1873, 2 full years before Joseph Walsh supposedly established this trust." Emma felt a surge of hope mixed with anger as the implications of the sheriff's discovery became clear. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to manufacture false documentation, to create legal complications where none had existed before. The question was who had orchestrated this deception, and why. Furthermore, Martinez continued, warming to his analysis, the language used in these trust documents contains legal terminology that wasn't in common usage until after Joseph Walsh's death. Whoever created these papers was either remarkably prescient about changes in legal language, or they were working from much more recent templates. Blackwood's face had grown pale as the sheriff systematically demolished the foundation of his case. "These are minor technical issues," he protested weakly. "The substance of the trust remains valid regardless of clerical errors in the documentation." "Minor technical issues?" Martinez repeated, his voice taking on the edge of professional indignation. "Mr. Blackwood, what we're looking at here isn't clerical errors. It's deliberate fraud. These documents were created specifically to interfere with the legal custody arrangement that was properly established through legitimate court proceedings." Emma stepped forward, no longer content to let the adults handle a situation that would ultimately be decided by her own choices and convictions. The months since her adoption had taught her that sometimes the most important battles were won not through legal maneuvering, but through moral clarity and the courage to stand up for what was right. "Even if those papers were real," she said, her voice carrying the clear authority of someone who had learned to speak for herself, "they wouldn't change my decision. I'm not a piece of property to be transferred from one owner to another according to arrangements I never agreed to. I'm a person with the right to choose my own future, and I choose to stay exactly where I am." Miss Hartwell stepped forward with the rigid posture of someone who was deeply offended by Emma's display of independence. Her thin face wore the expression of a teacher confronting a particularly willful student who needed to be put firmly in her place. "Young lady," she said in the condescending tone that adults often used when addressing children whose opinions they considered irrelevant, "you clearly don't understand the magnitude of what you're refusing. The Pemberton Academy represents opportunities that girls of your ground rarely receive. We're offering you the chance to transcend your humble origins and take your place in refined society." Emma looked at Miss Hartwell with something approaching pity, recognizing in the older woman's attitude the same fundamental misunderstanding that had characterized all the adults who had tried to determine her fate without consulting her preferences or understanding her needs. "Miss Hartwell," she replied with patience that belied her youth, "you keep talking about transcending my humble origins and taking my place in refined society, but you don't seem to understand that I don't consider my origins humble, and I'm not interested in the kind of place that refined society might offer me." She gestured toward Samuel and Clara, who stood flanking her with expressions of fierce protective pride. "These people took me in when I had nothing and nowhere to go. They loved me before they knew anything about my intelligence or potential. They've taught me to value character over appearances, substance over style, genuine accomplishment over social position. Why would I want to trade that for a world that judges people by their bloodlines and bank accounts?" Pemberton intervened with the pompous authority of someone who was accustomed to having his institutional credentials carry weight in any argument. "Miss Walsh or Harrison, if you prefer, you're speaking from the limited perspective of someone who has never experienced the advantages that proper education and social connections can provide. How can you possibly make an informed decision about opportunities you've never encountered? The same way you're making uninformed judgments about the value of the life I've chosen," Emma shot back. "You've been here less than an hour, but you've already decided that ranch life is inferior to academy life, that practical education is worthless compared to formal schooling, and that my family isn't good enough to provide what I need. How is your snap judgment any more valid than my considered decision based on months of actual experience?" Clara stepped closer to Emma, her maternal pride evident in every line of her face as she watched her daughter handle this challenge with wisdom and grace that would have been remarkable in someone twice her age. "Our daughter makes an excellent point," Clara said firmly, emphasizing Emma's status as a full member of the Harrison family. "You people arrived here with preconceived notions about what constitutes proper education and appropriate life choices for a young woman. You haven't bothered to observe Emma's actual education or assess her real needs. You've simply assumed that your way is better because it's more expensive and socially prestigious." Samuel moved to complete the family circle, his weathered hand resting protectively on Emma's shoulder. "What Emma learns here prepares her for real life, not some artificial society that values form over function. She studies mathematics by calculating feed rations and managing household budgets. She learns biology by caring for animals and understanding agricultural cycles. She develops leadership skills by training horses and organizing community projects. She practices public speaking by participating in church services and town meetings. How is any of that inferior to memorizing poetry and learning to paint watercolors?" Miss Hartwell's expression grew even more severe, as if she were personally offended by the suggestion that practical skills might have equal value to traditional feminine accomplishments. "Because proper education prepares young ladies for their appropriate role in society. A well-bred woman should be an ornament to her family and an asset to the man she marries, not some rough frontier creature who thinks she can compete with men in practical matters." "And what if Emma doesn't want to be an ornament?" Clara asked pointedly. "What if she wants to be a partner, a contributor, someone who makes the world better rather than just prettier? What if she wants to marry someone who values her intelligence and capabilities rather than her ability to serve tea and play piano?" The question highlighted the fundamental philosophical divide that separated the two groups. Emma realized that this confrontation wasn't really about education or legal documents, or even Papa's supposed intentions. It was about two completely different visions of what constituted a worthwhile life for a woman, and she knew exactly which vision aligned with her own values and aspirations. "I've heard enough," Sheriff Martinez declared, his professional patience finally exhausted. Mr. Blackwood, these documents are clearly fraudulent, created for the specific purpose of interfering with a legal custody arrangement that has already been finalized by proper court proceedings. I'm ordering you and your associates to leave the Harrison property immediately. Any further attempts to harass this family will result in formal charges for fraud, harassment, and conspiracy to interfere with legal custody arrangements. Blackwood's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled completely as he realized that his elaborate scheme had not only failed, but had exposed him to potential criminal charges. His face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger as he stuffed the fake documents back into his jacket. "This is a serious mistake," he protested weakly, but his voice had lost all its earlier authority. "These people are denying this child opportunities that any rational person would recognize as beneficial to her future." "What I recognize," Martinez replied coldly, "is a lawyer who has accepted payment to manufacture legal complications for a family that has already endured more than their fair share of outside interference. I also recognize fraud when I see it, and I'm strongly considering whether charges should be filed against you for attempting to use falsified legal documents to interfere with established custody arrangements." The threat of criminal prosecution was apparently enough to convince Blackwood that retreat was his best option. He mounted his horse with obvious haste, clearly eager to remove himself from a situation that had deteriorated so badly that his professional reputation and legal standing were now at risk. But Miss Hartwell wasn't ready to admit defeat quite so easily. She remained in place, her stern gaze fixed on Emma with the expression of someone who believed that one final moral lecture might still accomplish what legal maneuvering had failed to achieve. "My dear child," she said with condescending compassion, "I sincerely hope you won't come to regret this decision when you're older and more mature. The world beyond this ranch is larger and more complex than you can possibly imagine from your limited experience here. When you realize what you've given up, it may be too late to reclaim the opportunities you're refusing today." Emma looked at the older woman with genuine sadness, recognizing that Miss Hartwell genuinely believed she was trying to help, even as her efforts caused harm through their fundamental misunderstanding of what Emma actually needed and wanted. "Miss Hartwell," she replied gently, "you keep talking about my limited experience and the complex world beyond this ranch, but I think you might be the one whose experience is limited. You've spent so much time in fancy academies and proper society that you've forgotten what really matters in life. You know all about etiquette and social conventions, but you don't seem to understand anything about love, loyalty, courage, or the kind of strength that comes from choosing your own path instead of accepting the path others choose for you." The words were delivered without malice or anger, but they carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had faced real hardship and emerged stronger and wiser for the experience. Miss Hartwell had no response except a sniff of disapproval as she struggled to remount her horse with the obvious difficulty of someone unaccustomed to actual horseback riding. As the three unwelcome visitors finally departed from the Double H Ranch, their horses kicking up dust clouds that gradually settled back to earth, Emma felt a profound sense of finality that went far beyond the resolution of this particular confrontation. She had faced the last major external challenge to her place in the Harrison family, and she had prevailed not through legal technicalities or adult intervention, but through her own clarity about who she was and what she wanted from life. "I'm proud of you," Samuel said simply, his weathered hand still resting on Emma's shoulder with the gentle pressure of fatherly support and approval. "The way you handled yourself just now, the strength and wisdom you showed, that's the kind of character that can't be taught in any academy, no matter how prestigious or expensive." "You were absolutely magnificent," Clara added, gathering Emma into the kind of warm, encompassing embrace that had become as natural and necessary as breathing over the past year. "Papa would have been so proud of the young woman you've become, of the courage and intelligence you've developed, of the way you stand up for what matters." The mention of Papa brought a brief shadow of gentle sadness across Emma's face, but it was the soft sadness of love and cherished memory rather than the sharp, overwhelming grief that had once threatened to destroy her completely. I think Papa would be happy knowing that his daughter found exactly where she belongs, she said softly, with people who love her for who she is rather than who they think she should become. That evening, as the Harrison family sat together around their kitchen table, sharing Clara's pot roast and discussing the day's events, Emma found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had transformed her from a desperate refugee into a confident young woman with the courage to defend her chosen life against all challenges. "You know," Samuel said as they lingered over dessert, reluctant to end this moment of family togetherness, "when you first appeared at our door that stormy night, asking if you could sleep in our barn, I never could have imagined how much joy and purpose you would bring to this house. You've made us a complete family again in ways we didn't even realize we needed." "We saved each other," Emma replied, understanding the profound truth of those words as she spoke them. "You gave me a home and parents who love me unconditionally. I gave you a daughter who chose you deliberately and gratefully. That makes us stronger than any family that's based only on biological accident or legal obligation." Clara reached across the table to take Emma's hand, her eyes bright with tears of gratitude and overwhelming love. "When we lost Sarah, I thought that chapter of our lives was closed forever. I never imagined we would have another chance to be parents, to watch a child grow and learn and become everything she was meant to be. But you've given us that gift, and more, you've shown us that family isn't just about the children you give birth to, but about the children you choose to love and who choose to love you back." "And I never imagined," Emma said, her own voice thick with emotion, "that losing everything I thought I needed could lead to finding everything I actually needed. But that's exactly what happened when I asked to sleep in your barn and you told me I was family instead." The words hung in the air between them like a benediction, a recognition of the everyday miracle that had transformed all their lives through the simple power of choosing love over fear, inclusion over exclusion, hope over despair. Later that night, as Emma prepared for bed in the room that was truly and permanently hers, she paused at the window that looked out over the valley where her new life had taken root and flourished. The stars overhead were the same ones that had witnessed her desperate flight through the storm, her terrified arrival at the Harrison door, and her gradual transformation from frightened refugee to beloved daughter. But everything else had changed. The desperate child who had once stood at these crossroads with nowhere to go had become a confident young woman with the wisdom to recognize genuine love when she found it and the courage to defend it against all who would threaten it. The terrified plea for shelter in a barn had evolved into an unshakable conviction of belonging that no outside force could challenge, destroy. As she settled into bed beneath quilts that Clara had sewn with love and care, Emma whispered, prayer of gratitude for all the forces that had conspired to bring her to this moment of perfect contentment and security. She thanked the storm that had driven her to this door, the courage that had enabled her to ask for help, and most of all, the remarkable people who had looked at a lost child and decided to offer her not just temporary shelter, but permanent. Family. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and opportunities, its own chances to grow and learn and contribute to the life of the ranch and the wider community that had embraced her. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged, in the home she had chosen, with the family who had chosen her back, secure in the knowledge that love freely given and gratefully received was the strongest foundation anyone could ask for. Girl who had once asked desperately, "Papa died today, can I sleep in your barn, rancher?" had discovered something infinitely more valuable than shelter from the storm. She had found the place where a kind man could look at a lost child and say, with complete sincerity and permanent commitment, "You're family now." And in those three simple words lay the whole miracle of transformation, choice, and the kind of love that could heal any wound, overcome any obstacle, and turned the worst day of a young girl's life into the first day of her best life. Emma Harrison closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the sounds of home and the unshakable knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.